And we're live. Welcome back to yet another episode of the sci-fi. Nope, I did it again, Chris. It's all your fault. The Blasters and Blades podcast. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans! It's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just three nerdy veterans geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we will handle the debt I owe to the penny jar for getting the podcast name wrong. It's only been 3 years since we rebranded, Greg. So you figure I've got a few more years where I can milk this, right?
At least, yeah.
Outstanding. So you are Dr. Gregory Miller. Can you please introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Greg Miller. I currently teach at the Air Force's Air Command and Staff College. I've been here for about 4 years. I've been teaching for Department of Defense for about 10, and I have my PhD in political science. And so I'm one of those doctors that can't really help people, but that's me in a nutshell for now.
Okay. And because we have a special guest, because you write brainy stuff, so I wanted someone a little bit smarter than me, and we brought a friend of the show, Chris Denote on. So Chris, can you introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers?
Sure. Thanks, JR. Hey, everybody. Some of you might know me as Chris Denote, kind of a smallish time, brand new sci-fi guy and writer, not just mill sci-fi, but a few other things. But today I'm mostly talking in my day job capacity. So I'm Colonel Chris Denote, United States Air Force. I'm the Senior Intelligence Officer for the Continental U.S. NORAD region, 1st Air Force, which is also Air Force's Northern and now Air Force's Space, which is how I think I got roped into this little piece here. Just real quick before we go on, all opinions and thoughts I might express here are my own and do not represent the official position of the United States Air Force, the Department of Defense, or the United States government.
Mine definitely don't.
I'll ditto that for me.
Mine definitely don't. They don't like my opinions. Mostly,
I think I got you covered, Doc.
Thanks.
Yeah, mostly because I like to think out there. So, we go to the fun conspiracies, not because I believe them, but just because they're fun to think about. But, all right, so the next part of the introduction, dear listener, is how we found them. So I actually was talking to a friend of the show, Daniel, who runs the fan podcast for the Galaxy's Edge universe, and we had talked about potentially putting together on that end a panel talking about Sun Tzu in space. As the idea, not knowing this book existed. So I typed it into the old Google box and came up with Sun Tzu in Space by Dr. Gregory. And let me just throw that cover up because it's an attractive cover. There we go. Hold on. They moved all the StreamYard signals. There we go. So that's the cover. And I like, oh, so the book exists. Let's see if I can get him on the show. And then I had trouble tracking you down because I guess
they don't
my
like
Google
letting us out of the
failed
building
me.
if they can help it.
So Denote was like, well, all you got to do is type this into the search engine, you idiot, and the rest is history. So that's how we got here. So in a roundabout way, we found you through the Galaxy's Edge fandom. But Chris, as a first-time co-host, you get to ask the religion questions today. Are you ready for this? This is responsibility here, sir.
Oh, I think I could handle it. I haven't had the total lobotomy from Colonel School, so okay. So for the famous Blasters and Blades religion question, Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly? Over.
Does it have to be one of those three?
No, it does not.
So I will say up front, and this is actually a debate we have in the Department of Space Power here at ACSC, and the overwhelming sentiment is Star Trek because Star Wars is fantasy, not science fiction.
Okay.
I will admit my earliest memory, not just of a movie or series, but my earliest absolute memory is being 4 years old and waiting in line to see Star Wars when it first came out, the original Star Wars. And that scene when the Star Destroyers first opening and firing on the Counselor ship, that forever, got me hooked on science fiction. And so I have a special place in my heart for Star Wars. Having said that, I'm one of those jerks that hates everything since the original trilogy. And if I have to,
you're in good company here.
Absolutely.
If I have to pick one series that I could watch over and over and over again, of those three, it would be Firefly. But if I could go outside those three, it would actually probably be Stargate.
Oh, excellent choice.
And I just the stories, the acting is sometimes iffy, but it's maybe it's the Air Force side of me that I've bought into the Kool-Aid, and Stargate is Air Force. But like I said, if there was one series I had to watch over and over and over again, that would probably be the one.
Did you like Stargate Universe?
I liked Atlantis. Universe, not so much.
Okay, that's fair. So the
I like the premise. I just didn't think they pulled it off very well.
yeah, they kept getting, are we going to continue or not? So I think they got jerked around, and then they went to where all good shows go to die, otherwise known as Fox News, not Fox News, Fox, whatever their entertainment, Fox Entertainment. There we go. Because all the good shows go there, they get mismanaged, then they die, and they wonder why no one watches them because they don't put them on at the same time. So they didn't really have a chance to find their footing.
Well, it seems lately like those end up on getting rebooted on Hulu or something like that. So you never know. And it's interesting that you bring up Stargate too. Real quick story about that. So I've actually spent time inside Cheyenne Mountain, which, contrary to the movie War Games, actually looks more like the Navy did in fact build it. So it's actually a battleship inside a mountain, and it looks like it. But I actually know where Stargate Command is. It's on one of the men's rooms on the one of the lower floors. They got a big patch zap on the men's room door.
That's awesome. Do they make the toilet have like the ring so when you aim?
I think if I had to spend 4 hours or more in that place, I might need it. I don't
know. You can grow up, but you can't take the grunt out of me because I still laugh at potty humor. What can I say? All right, Chris, save me from myself. Ask the next question.
All right, so we're going to flip things around a little bit. So from the more fantastic side, I go with Star Wars science fantasy, but neither here nor there. Game of Thrones, The Wheel of Time, or Conan the Barbarian.
This might be the point where you kick me off the show. I have never read Wheel of Time, any of those books in the series. For some reason, I missed that. I was in a parallel universe when that came out or was popular. Of those three, God, Game of Thrones really sucked me in. And I love the fact that there's like everybody good becomes bad at some point and everybody bad becomes good at some point. But I don't know that I could go through it again. Of those three, probably Conan. Especially if we're talking about old school Conan.
So that was the one I was referring to. So first off, if you were in a parallel universe, that means that Stargate is real, people. You heard it here first. Just saying. And I started thinking about the Star Wars question where you answered all the original three were your favorites. I will say, are you familiar with the podcast, The Angry Staff Officers?
Is that related to the Twitter feed of the same name?
I believe so. It's a bunch of former military that got out at major, and so they ended their career as staff officers. And they tend to analyze history and fiction through the lens of logistics. So they actually analyzed Rogue Squad, or was it not Rogue Squadron? Rogue One. Is that the one, Chris, where they landed on the planet to take?
That's the one where they how they originally acquired the Death Star plans, but all anybody remembers is the end where Vader goes beast mode on everybody.
Yeah, so they analyzed that one and they said it's the only one where Star Wars and George Lucas got it right when it comes to considering logistics and how that affected everything. So it got at least a meh from the Angry Staff Officers, and they're generally very critical. I mean, like they hammered the crap out of George Martin's Game of Thrones and why none of that made tactical sense at the end.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's funny you brought up Wheel of Time. I never got into that either. I took one look at the size of those books and I was like, yeah, no. But I have read the Robert E. Howard Conan series and a little bit of some of his other guys, Bran McMorn and what's his name, Solomon Kane and all that kind of stuff. So I enjoy the old stuff too. I think that's just the way it's saying we're all old.
The Conan movies are great too. You can't go wrong with Arnold and running around with his shirt off or whatever.
Okay. So we here at the Blasters and Blades love both the scientific and the fantastical, but what was your first love? Was it sci-fi or fantasy?
It goes back and forth. As really young, it was science fiction. I was super into Star Wars. As I got older and started reading and getting into fiction, I dove into C.S. Lewis and Narnia and all the Tolkien books. I really got into the Xanth series with Pierce Anthony.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Nightmare and Ogre. I mean, that was probably the first real series that I got into and couldn't wait for the next one to come out. Guardians of the Flame was another one that was a really cool series that actually kind of got me interested in like Dungeons and Dragons types of games. But nowadays it's almost exclusively science fiction. And I think that's more related to my job talking about space. There's to me a little bit more natural connection between the two. I still love my fantasy role-playing video games, and I'm dying to see the new Dungeons and Dragons movie. But at this point in my life, I lean a little bit more towards the science fiction.
Okay. So what is it about speculative fiction as a genre, as an umbrella term, and specifically science fiction, since that's your current passion, that you love so much?
The ones that I do love, what I love about them is they're the really good ones, in my opinion, take a problem that the author knows about or has experienced and puts that in a different time or a different place and changes a couple of variables just to see, what if we do something different? How does it come out differently? One of the best examples of that is Haldeman's Forever War,
Okay.
which is about future war, but it is basically his experience in Vietnam, and down to how he's treated when he comes back home, not feeling like he's part of society anymore, even though he hasn't been gone very long in his perspective. I mean, it's just those kinds of things. How do we solve problems that we're experiencing today, or that the author has experienced, if we just change a couple factors, change a couple things around? That to me is where science fiction is really powerful.
And you could say much too for David Drake in that context. Same thing, turning his Vietnam experiences into the Hammer Slimer series back in the day. And I think that's a real good thread that the GE guys, Galaxy's Edge guys, hit on for the GWAT generation. Honestly, I think that's one of the reasons why what they do resonates so well with them.
Yeah, I think our experience during the GWAT era in the military is vastly different than what became before and what came after. They let us get away with some. For just an example, some of the stuff we got away with pulling because we were operational all the time, like in peacetime, it would have been an entirely different story. So I think it created a different culture. But you mentioned that from what I got from what you liked about science fiction, it sounded like you liked to read stories from the everyman perspective. Was that right? Or do you like the sort of the God's eye view when you read?
I don't know if I have a favorite. I like both if it's well written, if it sort of keeps my attention and makes me think in ways I haven't thought about before. This is jumping ahead a little bit, but one of the other things I really like about science fiction is it forces you to think in creative ways.
Okay.
And I really like using that with my students because it gets them out of their comfort zone and trying to solve problems in ways that maybe they hadn't thought of before. And science fiction is one of the best ways to kind of train your brain to do that.
I think I noticed that the first time I wrote the prequel to the very first series I wrote, I had a battle in a space station, and as former infantryman, and as I led 9 grunts myself. I started thinking, crap, everything I know about tactics doesn't work because 1, you can't shoot through the walls. That's very bad if you expose yourself to vacuum. And 2, now you've got to think in 3 dimension. So none of our formations work. And so I actually spent probably a month trying to think of what formations might look like if you had to think in 3 dimensions. So you don't realize it until you actually start trying to think in those terms and sort of apply what you think to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So did you notice that yourself, Chris, when you were writing your sci-fi, or do you think your Air Force experience sort of vaccinated you against that, inoculated you?
More like your situation, and flip it around, because I'm not a grunt. I did one deployment with Air Force cops doing base defense and coin stuff in Iraq, but the rest of my career has been supporting aviation or doing command and control at the operational level in the staff. So I can write, from the 3-dimensional perspective, with a little help, and I've gotten that assistance here and there from other authors we know. But then trying to drill back down and write something from that tactical door kicking standpoint. That's actually where I've had to slow down and go out and get help from others. But that's sort of like how I actually got pulled in, was to help bridge the gap between some of the writers we know in common, JR, and help them out with a
Yeah.
little expertise they didn't have.
I will say that the boots on the ground Air Force guys, because my unit in Iraq was replaced by one of those. Man, they were asked to do a lot with very little training and very little equipment, and getting our hands off the hand-me-downs that the Army wanted to just get rid of. So it's like, oh, sure, we'll give it to the Air Force, which normally the Air Force is known for having the nicest stuff. But when we were in Iraq, that was not the case. And we had some of the drivers from the Air Force side that were literally, oh, you're just going to drive pilots to and from the airports or whatever, was what they thought Motor T in the Air Force meant. And suddenly you throw them in the middle of downtown Baghdad at the height of the war, and it was like, oh man, that's not what they thought they signed up for. So I had a lot of respect for what those Air Force guys had to do. I mean, because at least we had the training, right? Like, I didn't have to learn in the middle of a firefight, oh crap, I got to set the headspace and timing on my 50 cal. So yeah, it's definitely a different experience.
And a lot of times too is when you're writing things that are like more from the bigger level, like the theater level, for example. Like, now we're not just talking about a single battle, we're talking about the course of an entire campaign. Or like in the case of some stuff I wrote for Bane, looking at a continent-wide offensive that's going on from the the commanding officer's standpoint. So, which I think will probably feed a lot into Dr. Miller's work here a little bit, perhaps as we get a little further on.
So diving into that, how do you think your love of speculative fiction, how do you integrate that into your work in academia and national security, Greg?
I don't know that I have until this book. And in some ways, this book was kind of cathartic for me because it allowed me to do that. Most of my work before has been very just sort of academic, theoretical, or hopefully in some cases practical. But this is the first time I've really been able to incorporate science fiction. Now, I do think, going back to my previous point, I do think a lot of my work is more creative because of the fact that I read fairly vigorously, fiction. I think some of my previous work, I like to think some of my previous work countered conventional wisdom and challenged things that people were thinking at the time. And I do attribute that a little bit to science fiction, but until this book, I haven't really been able to incorporate it directly.
Okay. Was that a enjoyable experience to be able to do that finally?
Absolutely. I mean, this book is sort of the culmination of all the things that I enjoy doing in academia. It's a little international relations, it's a little history, it's a little science fiction. And luckily I had an editor at Naval Institute Press that not only sort of prompted me to do it, but then encouraged me. And so this was great.
Okay. Does is the Air Force have their own institute press, or does all the military sort of use the Navy one?
No, they do. There is an Air University Press, and it publishes quite a bit of books, some good ones. But I had a couple of connections at Naval Institute. The main person who kind of inspired me to write this and worked on it was at University of Oklahoma Press at the time when I first started it. He moved over to Naval Institute and was basically, I want to take this book with me. And so that's how it got there.
Okay. That's fair.
So Doctor, a lot of authors, such as JR, myself, we let real life experiences influence the stories we tell. So, are there any specific moments that really shaped you and your work? Something really foundational for you from your own life?
I don't know, not directly about the stories or the books themselves. One of the things that I realized as I was writing this book is most of my academic career, I've been very pessimistic and cynical, and very realist. States are selfish, people are selfish. The future is bleak. And about little over 7 years ago, 7.5 years ago, my son was born, and then I came to ACSC. I started working on space, and there's a ton of optimism surrounding space, especially the people who are teaching it and working in it. And I got consumed by that, and so I guess those experiences, becoming a dad again, changing jobs, coming to teach for people in the space concentration here, just really kind of changed my perspective on the future. And I think that shows up a little bit in this book, a lot in this book, actually.
Okay.
That's funny you say you're sort of an optimist too, because I admit I'm a bit of a classical realist myself, but I try to not be as just like you to try to not be entirely cynical about it. You know, like the old saying goes, all theories are wrong, some theories are useful, right? Or all models, however you want to look at it. So for next question on that, sort of feeding into this one is, what do you think is the interplay for your time actually instructing military students, and how does that bleed back into your professional writing?
I mean, it's one of the reasons I love teaching in professional military education. I learned so much from my students. Before I started working on space, I spent the first almost 2 decades of my academic career studying terrorism, writing about terrorism, teaching about terrorism. That's probably part of the reason I was so pessimistic about everything. But I mean, the great thing about that is I would walk into a class with a bunch of majors, lieutenant colonels, colonels, and learn a ton of stuff from them on the practical side, whereas most of mine was very theoretical and academic. And the same is true now doing space. I mean, I've got acquisitions and space operators and JAG and all these different career fields in our program. And every single day I walk in the classroom, I have things that I'm hopefully teaching them, but I walk out of there usually smarter for it. And so I think that plays into the stuff that I write. I hope it does. I hope it makes it a little bit more useful and practical to those students, because that ultimately is what we're trying to do here is give them some tools in their toolkit to go out and not necessarily fight wars, but be more strategic in their thinking how to avoid wars.
So you mentioned that you started in space terrorism, or terrorism, and then you moved to space. Are you familiar with the Halo franchise that started with the video games and then became the books and movies?
I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
They actually started that series with the idea of space terrorism because that's what the Halo Master Chief program, which actually the Spartan programs were designed to do, to counter the insurrectionists. So there are people even thinking about what that terrorism looks like in a world where we're space bound. So there's ways for you to merge those two as well.
Yeah, and one of my first my first article about space was basically future guerrillas, insurgents, and space pirates, drawing on a lot of that work that I had done on terrorism and applying it to the future. So yeah, one of the things that I see myself as contributing to the field of space is the things that I've done before this, the international relations, the strategy, the terrorism stuff, and how does that apply to our understanding of space in the future?
Okay. Sorry to interrupt, Chris. I just question.
No, that was awesome. That was great, because next question was going to be about how, like, the interaction with your students, is that affecting what you choose to read now? Is that affecting your reading list and what you gravitate towards?
Yeah, I mean, directly. One of the electives I teach here is called Science Fiction and Strategy. And every year it fills up. I've got 10 or 12 students in the class every year. And at the end of the class, I'll say, what are the 4 or 5 books I need to read before I teach this class again? And, almost every year I end up changing the course syllabus because of books they recommend. At a minimum, I open those books. And because of that, I've found some really good books that I otherwise wouldn't have picked up. Children of Time is a really good one that a student recommended. And I devoured that in a weekend, even though it's like 600 pages. So yeah, I mean, the students are directly affecting that part of my reading list. Probably that's the most direct way I can think of.
Okay. So your book is a call for military officers to expand their horizons and read science fiction in addition to nonfiction, something many professional military types tend to be dismissive of. What kind of reaction have you gotten from those who've read your book with that as your recommendation?
Well, I mean, the book isn't really out yet. I mean, it's available on Kindle, but the hard
Okay.
copy isn't available for another week and a half. So I haven't really gotten a lot of feedback yet. A couple of my colleagues have read it, and they seem to like it, but I'm also their supervisor, so they have to say that. Um, I'm trying to avoid the Goodreads review pages. So I don't really know what the feedback is yet, but I'm hoping it'll be positive, and I'm hoping that that'll at least generate a conversation about the value, not just of science fiction, but of just broadening our reading lists. And I'm not the first person to talk about that. There's a retired Australian Army General, Mick Ryan, who's been talking about that for probably a decade now. And was doing that even when he was still active duty. And so I think there's a recognition that there's value in just reading, regardless of what it is. Challenge your preconceptions, challenge your perceptions of the world. But I mean, for me, the best way to do that is science fiction, because like I said, in the really good ones, it does relate to real world problems. It does parallel things that we're dealing with today. You just have to identify what are those parallels, and what is the author really trying to say.
So the Marine Corps actually does something like that already. They pair science fiction authors with military personnel to sort of come up with books or stories. I think it's short stories for an anthology they do every year. I can't remember the name of it. I will find it and write that down in the show notes for you, dear listener. But there are already people starting to think about what the implication of speech or of space is for the future, and not just from the military side, even the from the human side. Uh, for those of you who are religious, forgive me if I get this wrong, but I remember in high school reading that the College of Cardinals was talking about how, and I could be getting the names wrong, but how we would react to if we just find life out there. Because sentient life aside, we're still likely to run into amoebas at a minimum, and so how you determine if it's a space cow and you can eat it, or it's one of God's creatures and it's your equal kind of thing. And it got me realizing that lots of people are grappling with what might leaving terra firma due to our preconceived ideas of the world. And Chris, I know you're very Catholic, so if you wanted to correct me how I got that, because we've talked about this before, I just can't remember the terms.
No, I know what you're talking about. I got to go back and try to find the article you're talking about specifically, because I was thinking about that too. And as far as the whole just building out the reading list, I think what it's impressive to do is to like Dr. Miller said, you got to get across. I don't want. I hate the overuse of the word genre, but you got to get across genre, and you got to get cross subject and a bit interdisciplinary with it. I think that goes a long way to understanding the world too. And it's funny because especially with the books coming out, now, and with the current generation of service members that are either just coming in or just leaving, or just leaving and sailing off into retirement. Like I'll be in the not too distant future. That difference of perspective between us is interesting as well.
Absolutely. So go ahead.
And back to I think what maybe this start of your question. I mean, there is skepticism about a course like this, science fiction and strategy, right? I mean, taxpayers are not paying officers to come read science fiction, and I think that's probably not exclusive to the military. I mean, if I was teaching a course like this at a civilian university, there would be people that would question its validity. The reality is, if you look at my syllabus, students are reading a novel every week. We spend 3 hours in class dissecting the novel and the people in it, who's a good leader, who's a bad leader, who's a strategic thinker, and why, what types of policies are they trying to enact? What are their ends? Whether the civil relations implications of these things. I mean, I try to tie it to the core curriculum so that there's a direct connection. But also, they're just, because they embrace the course. They're reading 400 or 500 pages a week that they otherwise might not read. And to me, that's the real value of it.
So I'm assuming that if you're putting them on the syllabus, you've read these books too. I figure that's a fair assessment. Have any of your students convinced you to change your mind on various characters when you're going through these discussions?
Yeah, they have. I mean, your assumption is wrong. Sometimes this is the dirty secret behind the door. Sometimes professors will put books on the syllabus to force us to read the books we want to read.
Okay.
And I'm guilty of that. I read it before the class starts, but not always before I put it on the syllabus. Yeah, I mean, I can't necessarily think of a specific example right now where a student changed my mind, but I know there have been some there's a book called Robopocalypse, which is very similar to like World War Z, if you've read that by Max Brooks. But it's robots instead of zombies. And, you know, I don't want to spoil the story, but in talking to the students, I think they convinced me that the whole AI's purpose behind everything that it does is actually different than what it seems when you first read through it. And so that's one example that comes to mind. I think there's, you know, we always talk about Colonel Graff in Ender's Game, you know, how ethical he is using the children to achieve a greater objective. I sort of flip-flop on that, depending on how persuasive the students are in a particular class. So yeah, that happens. I mean, I think I'm open-minded enough that I can be swayed by a compelling argument.
And as far as like the anthologies you were mentioning, JR, I know the Marine Corps had that program. Like you're right, it was like Marine Corps Futures program or something. The Army had that because I think Dr. Rob Hanson participated in that, and so did Chuck Gannon. And then I know he did the Marine Corps one, and then the Air Force made an attempt at it a few years ago, and I actually submitted a story for that. It was the first time I was going to try and get some fiction published. That was back when I was a major. That didn't seem to get off the ground very far. But hey, you never know. Dr. Miller's course here might convince the Air Force to give it another go.
Okay, and I will track down as much of that as I can, dear listener, including the English staff officers. So if you want to check that stuff out yourself, it's definitely worth the time. So I know we ask these questions generally to writers that are writing, you know, the fiction, but sometimes people like nonfiction enough that they want them signed. So has anybody asked for your autograph since you started writing academically?
I mean, yes, technically, again, a couple of people that I work with have asked me to sign the book. That's sort of a token gesture that academics do when we get a book published. It's sort of like when an officer gets promoted, he takes everybody out for drinks. We pass out a copy of our book and sign it, but not like in an airport or, you know, randomly on the street where somebody sees me and asks for my autograph. Nothing like that.
You're not in the side chat, dear listener, but Denode is telling us that his 06 promotion party was very pricey. We had it easy. We just go to as an NCO, just go to the NCO club and have a few drinks, and it didn't cost me that much.
Yeah, Mr. Wallet was definitely hurting that day. Let's just say that.
So, were you when you were promoted? Was it during an operational tempo? Because that was, luckily for me, that's partly why it was so cheap. Because everyone was coming and going. Was that your situation as well?
No, that was in garrison. So everybody decided to be my friend that day.
Okay, all right. So since you've started writing, because obviously there's the publisher perish mindset in a lot of academic circles when it comes to professors. What was the most impactful interaction you've had with readers of your work, and including this one or anything you've published previously since you started writing?
So the quick story, long story made short. When I first started teaching in PME, I went for about 5 years without writing much. I was consumed with learning the acronyms and, you know, learning the combatant commands and things that were learning how to use DTS, all the bureaucratic stuff and teaching a ton. And I just didn't have a lot of time for writing. And I one day just posted a comment on social media, I think it was Facebook, and said something like, I love teaching for PME. I never get to write, and it's not a priority, and it bums me out. Just, venting like we sometimes do on social media. And somebody who I'm friends with on social media and know, very minimally, but is a professor that I admire, look up to his work. He commented on that and basically said something like, that's a shame because you do really good work and I want to see more of it. And that for me, I think was kind of a trigger. It more than anything else killed my imposter syndrome that I was still walking around with a little bit as an academic. And basically from that point, I've been writing, not nonstop, but pretty heavily. And most of my publications have actually been, more than half of my publications have been since he said that 5 years ago. So that was maybe the most influential thing that's happened to me, academically in that sense.
So speaking of that writing, can you give us the Reader's Digest version of your body of work?
Sure. This is the part where we jump the shark and everyone tunes out and goes and gets a snack. Most of my work all my work is academic in some respects, and academic in both the positive and the negative sense, I guess. Like I said, the first decade and a half of my career really focused on terrorism and international relations. I spent a lot of time writing about reputation. That was actually my first book, was built off my dissertation and was about international reputations, whether states benefit from having a good reputation or suffer costs from having a bad reputation. I've written about energy security and some of the sort of unconventional ways of thinking about going independent of importing oil from other countries. A lot of my work focuses on deterrence of one form or another, deterring terrorist groups, deterring threats in space, comparing space deterrence to nuclear deterrence. I have a piece on sort of an odd way of thinking about orbital debris, despite the fact that it's a problem. I actually argue that there's a security risk involved in getting rid of orbital debris. It actually is, while it exists, it acts as a little bit of a deterrent from engaging in kinetic attacks in space. And so getting rid of it will remove that deterrent. And
Interesting.
There's the space pirate article that I'm really fond of. So I've been sort of a jack of all trades. I kind of go where I'm interested, jumping around from terrorism to strategy to now space. Again, hopefully having some practical application, but like most academic work, probably, it's a good day if 3 or 4 people ever read it. So.
All right. Well, that's fair. Thank you for giving that highlight. And before we dive into Sun Tzu in Space, which is the novel that brought us here, we're going to pause for a moment while we shamelessly shill for the man. So thank you, Cheney, for sponsoring this episode.
Van, I know this is hard for you to accept or even believe, but you're not imagining this. You're not going crazy. Your grandfather believed right down to the core of his being in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves.
You expect me to believe that my grandfather was a star-faring soldier?
I can prove it to you.
And how are you going to do that?
By taking you for a flight. Whenever you're ready, Van.
All right. I am very jealous that Podium Publishing made that commercial for them. Chris, we need something like that for stuff we write. It's just not fair.
Is
I know,
anyone
that's
else
pretty
getting a
sweet.
Lost Starfighter vibe off of that?
I did too. When I first saw it too. It gets me every time. I've seen it several times because they've sponsored a few shows. But yeah, Chris, now it's on to you. And if you're listening, dear listener, when we get off script that we normally use, which was the intro, this is all Chris's big brain stuff. So we're going to give him a round of applause for his help on this one.
Wow. Okay. Appreciate it. So something I wanted to bring up too, Dr. Miller, is hey, I want to pick your brain on that space debris article at a later date. You know, from a day job sense, that'd be. I've got some questions for you on that one.
All right.
But that can wait for down the road. All
We
right.
don't want to bore everybody.
Nah. So for talking about Sun Tzu in space, a couple quick ones for you here on that. One, where'd you get the premise? Is it going to be a standalone, or is it going to like help you kickstart a series, something like a Clausewitz in Space follow up or something like that? So how's you? What drove you to that particular title and theme?
I don't really know, to be honest. It seemed like a good title for a book. I don't want to say that I started with a title and then wrote the book, but it may have happened that way. I actually started with the premise of how do we take the past and apply that to the future? How do we understand our future based on what we've already been through as a human race? And one of the things we teach here is Sun Tzu's Art of War. And it seemed like his maxims were ripe for applying to the future. And so it all just kind of came together that way. I don't actually remember where that title came from, which is maybe horrible. It's like forgetting your child's name or something, but yeah, that was maybe it came in an epiphany and in a dream. What was the second part of the question?
Oh, sorry. Second part was it? Are you going to do follow-ups to this along with
Right. Yeah, I probably yes. I'm already writing a book. I've already talked to Naval Institute Press about a follow-up. I don't think it's going to be Clausewitz in Space or Hard in Orbit. There's what I'm thinking of doing. What I would like to do is take some of the ideas that are very big and broad and theoretical in this book and write a book that is more of a practical, how do we get to these future scenarios that I've identified would be more positive than negative. Right now, the working title is Strategy in a Vacuum. And it's basically, how do we write a strategy for space to achieve the kind of futures that would be beneficial as opposed to the ones that would sort of keep us in the pessimistic world that we tend to be in historically. So yes, there's a follow-on, not really a sequel though.
Okay, that's interesting. You bring up a much more of a how do we get from here to there. It almost sounds like something more like you'd get from a strategic forecasting type outfit, like say a Stratfor or somebody, almost like that.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's one of the courses I teach here is strategy, strategic decision making, and we give our students hands-on experience developing a strategy. And I think there's value in doing that. There's a lot written about strategy, but there's a lot that doesn't necessarily translate to the real world. There's a lot in doctrine that is just very dry and not very useful in my view. So I think there's a place to kind of bridge the gap between the big strategic writings and the strategic doctrine, but also, applying it to space, which I think there's value in doing. If we want to achieve a Star Trek Federation type of future where all of us come together to deal with our problems, right? We need a plan for how to get there. And so that's tentatively the book that I'm writing right now. We'll see if that's how it turns out.
Star Trek had me at the holodeck. Just saying. All right. Sorry to interrupt, Chris.
No, we're good.
We kind of have that with virtual reality. It's getting there.
Do you think? I know a lot of people. It makes them sick at this point. It's not. It hasn't crossed that line yet.
Well, I think well, you almost answered this in your previous answer there, but who is kind of like your target audience for this book coming out? Is it for the strategy practitioner? Is it more for the layman? Could Is it something that could be presented even down at, say, a high school or a collegiate level, let alone practicing service members?
Yeah, I mean, my goal when writing this, I had multiple audiences in mind. The primary one was sort of the graduate level international relations or history student or scholar that likes science fiction and wants to figure out how to kind of tie their hobby, their interest into their career. I was hoping that there would be some PME, professional military education interest in it, because I think it's a fairly straightforward guide to international relations, which most PME institutions teach in some form or another, but I think it's a fun way to do it as opposed to the sort of old school journal articles. I think it's accessible to high school, college. They might get a little lost in some of the language, especially in the international relations sections. But each chapter is sort of modular in a sense. It starts with a future scenario. Then it has the international relations that are related to that scenario. Then it has the history that sort of parallels, or that scenario parallels in our past. And then it dives into the science fiction that are connected to the story. And so somebody who was interested just in the science fiction could read the opening scenario and the section on science fiction and skip over the boring academic-y stuff. And so I think it's accessible to a wide audience, but really my primary target were the people who were studying this and just wanted a little more hands-on understanding of how they all tie together.
Hey, I figure tying together your work, your day job and your hobby is never a bad thing. I got to do my war college capstone on wargaming, so I've got a 2-for-1 on that. So I feel you on that one, definitely. JR had a good question here about the cover earlier. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got that?
Yeah, I mean, that was just that's a NASA photo. Astronaut Scott Kelly took that. I want to say 2015, 2016, when he was up in the International Space Station. So it's NASA. It's public domain. I happened to find it when I was just scouring pictures of space to see what would be a good cover for the book. And then Naval Institute Press did their magic and made it into a cover. So it's just, astronaut Scott Kelly's photograph from the ISS.
That there's supposed to be some report coming out soon that they haven't released to the public that I know of about Scott Kelly, because if I remember correctly, he's the one that had a twin that spent down on Earth while he was in orbit for the year, and comparing in a more clinical way exactly what the effect space has on the body. So I'm curious to see how that plays out. Have you followed that as well?
I'm aware of it. I haven't seen a report. I don't know what the findings are. I know preliminarily, I think I heard that he had some vision issues that his twin didn't have. I mean, his twin is now a senator. And so, pretty useful family there. But it'll be interesting to see that you don't get too many twins where one goes up in space and one doesn't. You can sort of use them as test subjects to see how space affects the body.
And do it ethically, because that's the problem with test subjects is, those pesky medical ethics.
Yeah, only if you tell people you're doing it.
Yeah. Only.
So, all right, Chris, it's still you.
All right. So I'm actually curious to hear how you do this. So what's your sort of real quick 30-second elevator pitch for the books, like to help us spread the word around and drum up some interest for you? How should we talk about it to people?
30-second elevator pitch. All right. How do we use what we know about our history to try to understand our possible futures and direct us in the one that's going to provide us with the most benefit for the least cost, or at least benefit the most people in a number of different ways, avoiding conflict and violence, promoting standard of living, getting us out into outer space so we aren't, all stuck on this one planet in the event of a catastrophe. Just thinking through some of the big ideas of how do we get to where we want to be in the future.
Okay. And
Okay.
without spoiling sort of the scenarios you've put in there, is there a particular sci-fi author that you think has gotten things, we'll say, more or mostly right in terms of predicting the present day and future thus far, um, and whether or not that influenced you?
Um, honestly, I mean, the way that I approach this book, each scenario draws on different ways of thinking about science fiction, and so the first chapter is a very offensive realist focus. Imagine there's a scenario where there's one major power in space, one hegemon that controls all of space. And we have a number of examples of that where you have galactic empires and the Padisha Emperor and Dune. There's a lot of authors who kind of get that right if that's one of the futures. There's another scenario focuses on a situation where you don't have states involved anymore in space. It's all private corporations. And what would that future look like? And there's a number of stories that are similar to that. There's a TV series called Dark Matter, where a lot of the primary actors were corporations. You've got the big bad corporation in the Alien series, right? And so it's hard to say there's one author that gets it right because we don't know what that future is going to look like. I think when we look back, it will be able to say, hey, that author got it more right than everybody else because this is how it turned out. And what I tried to do in the 7 scenarios I present in the book is talk about some of the authors that are related to each of those possible futures.
Okay. Let's see. So
Okay.
speaking, just one more piece on this, and then I'll hand it back to JR. So in your talk here, and also in the actual written description of the book, pulling it off the webpage, you mentioned the cyclical nature of history. So that got me thinking about how do you think your readers should think about the past as we experience what really seems to be accelerating technological and geopolitical change? I mean, if anything, the rate of change seems to be vastly outpacing over the last few years, what we've even had in the previous 20 from a personal point of view. But how do you tie that back into a cyclical view on history?
That sounds like a War College comps question. If that's where you're getting that.
It's what we do.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing that we talk about with our students, especially here in the space concentration. I mean, the historian in me will say that every era has thought that their technology was progressing at an unprecedented pace, and society was forever going to change, and it does. It's hard for us now to put ourselves in the situation of soldiers first seeing airplanes flying overhead in battle, or sailors first seeing aircraft carriers on the oceans. Yes, technology seems to be progressing and doing so more rapidly than ever, but I don't know that the chaos that seems to be creating is any different than it has in the past. And I think that's always going to be the case. 100 years from now, people are going to be saying, look how fast technology is advancing compared to what it was at the beginning of the 21st century. And so I think history still provides us a lot of important lessons, even if it's true that technology is advancing faster today than it was. The way that people dealt with new technology, the way that nations used it or didn't use it, those can still provide us really important lessons. In that first chapter on hegemony with the one dominant actor, I talk about the Roman Empire and some of the reasons that it rose and fell. I talk about the British Empire and the same thing. Why did it rise? Why did it fall? We can learn those lessons because if we want a future where the United States is a cislunar or solar hegemon, we can learn what those empires have done wrong and try to avoid those mistakes. And likewise, if some other country is trying to be the solar hegemon, we can learn how the Gauls defeated the Romans and take the lessons from the other side and try to prevent it from happening. So I think history still has value even in an unprecedented age. But I am sort of a closet historian, and so that's maybe that part of me talking.
That's fair, and I'm a history nerd myself. Went to college for it even, and now I'm actually using it on a podcast. So, see, Mom, I can use my degree. So one of the things they've talked about, and they've actually done some research, is how people learn about technology, and there's a difference between people that are exposed to technology in their mid to later life versus people that grow up with technology versus people where it was just always there. So, for instance, people that initially started driving the automobile tried to understand how the combustion engine worked, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas we grew up, automobiles were always just a thing and we just did it. The same applies with technology, smartphone, et cetera. Do you think that's going to play a factor with how we develop things? Because I could, Terry Mixon, it's a sci-fi author I absolutely adore. One of the things he wrote in one of his books was the idea that the Naval Academy was just going to give simulated games to with all the tech that they had just acquired, because it's a Galactic Empire Refound sort of story, his Empire of Bones, was they'll give it to the kids because they don't know what the rules are supposed to be and what they're not supposed to be able to do. So they find creative ideas as they play with the tech because it's just there. Do you think that has room outside of science fiction? Those kinds of concepts, which we have some understanding on the social psychology of?
Maybe. I mean, that's also very similar to the reason that they use Ender in Ender's Game, right? I mean, he's a child, and so he's not accustomed to having to do things a certain way. He's more creative in his thinking. And I absolutely agree with that premise. I mean, my 7-year-old can do things with an iPad and hack into my phone when it's locked and do all kinds of things that I don't even know is possible, just because he's grown up with it. And that's going to continue. I mean, at some point, if we have true AI, if we have autonomous vehicles, driving us around on a daily basis, it's going to seem like a normal occurrence to the newer generations, and old people like me are going to be like, yeah, I remember when I had to start the car with my finger. I don't know. I mean, I think there's probably a way to incorporate that into other places. I don't know that I'm smart enough to think through those steps.
Well,
Okay.
You could always think about it like you're seeing a little bit of this play out in Ukraine, believe it or not. You've got oftentimes rather low tech and inexpensive solutions being thrown against incredibly expensive tactical problems. So there's a cost curve there, but then there's also sometimes all of us older guys, hey, I'm a history nerd too, remember when things weren't so quite ubiquitous, so that, like JR brought up, we remember how we got there, or secondly, how to break it or go around it and do a different alternative. So, and which was something that Haldeman pointed out too. I think like basically at the dead of Mav. Oh, you like that word there, JR? At the
I do. I'm writing that down.
They go all the way from every type of sci-fi weapon imaginable to end up back with spears and axes and halberds and stuff in the final battle scene. Because other technology, armor, energy shields, good old-fashioned force field type stuff has come full circle. So, I think a good point on that is, hey, never throw away some of that old stuff, man. It's like that box of cables of weird sizes that all of us dudes all have.
Oh my God, I just went through mine. So I have to say, if we get to self-driving cars, I will forever be Corbin Dallas in Fifth Element when he was the taxi driver in the beginning. If you've seen it, that will always be me, even if they've got robots to drive the car. So are you? You mentioned you were a little bit of a pessimist about the future, but as things develop, do you are you still pessimistic or optimistic now? Excuse me, I said pessimist. I meant optimist. Your book describes how things could go either right or very wrong. Do you have a bet on which way this plays out?
I mean, I'm not gonna bet my house on either way. I have a lot of faith in the younger generation to do things better than we did, just in terms of the planet and politics. And so in that respect, I'm very optimistic. I'm sitting here next to my Department of Defense computer, which I affectionately call my doorstop. There's a part of me that's still very pessimistic about our ability to do things effectively and efficiently. And I think that's going to be our downfall, as not just the United States, but as a human race, if we don't do some of the more optimistic things. But I mean, in general, I think we're at a really potentially good place as a human race, right? I mean, we've got plans for going back to the moon after 60 years. We've got plans for going to Mars. Yes, it's a lot of that's in the hands of private corporations, which scares me a little bit. But I'm enough of a capitalist to hope the market will balance everything out. And we'll see. I know that's an awful answer. It didn't really answer your question, but I'm not a futurist. I'm not a prognosticator, and so I don't know that I can answer that any better.
Okay, that's fair. I will say that when it comes to government procurement, at least we learned some things. Hopefully, we don't forget them again after we learn them. But I remember when we were in, part of the issue was the military, when they want to procure something, they give down to the millimeter specs of what they want built, which of course makes things more expensive, takes slower to do, research takes longer. As the war was at its height, they started saying, oh, we needed to do this, and then they let the experts on the outside design it, which is how we went from the crappy helmets that we had in the early war to lighter ones that were more ergonomic, that were more functional. But they said, those football players over there in the NFL, they've been protecting their head for a long time. Let's see what they can do. And so they started reaching out. They did the same thing. I was involved to a lesser degree with convoys saying, NASCAR's been driving fast with hot engines. Let's see what they can do. And so we're starting to realize that sometimes the process can become the problem. So hopefully we didn't forget it since I left and GWAT sort of wrapped up.
Yeah, and I think it ties into space really well because for a long time you had the sort of old establishment, the old defense contractors who were saying this is the only way that we can do space, and you get folks like SpaceX and Blue Origin saying, well, no, we can do it differently. We can make these reusable rockets and do it much cheaper. We don't have to rely on Russia anymore. We can build these things on an assembly line. We can put constellations of satellites up in one launch. I mean, there is a lot of progress being made in space as a result of just the private market saying we can do this better and cheaper and more effectively. And hopefully the government's taking notice. We'll see.
Well, it's funny you bring up SpaceX and NASA, because the difference between the Artemis program in terms of how it's being done, sort of the classic NASA way, and how SpaceX gets things done is incredibly stark. I mean, when you compare it to side by side, it's two totally different approaches. I think to the putting people in orbit problem, and that affects how we do things actually. Even as AppSpace, because of the human spaceflight support mission, personal recovery, God forbid something really bad happens. But along those lines, I think the greater presence of commercial entities in space, do you see that as sort of encouraging or perhaps discouraging more international cooperation going down the road? Or do you think it'll have little to no effect then?
I think it's going to have mixed effect. One of the things that I wrote about a couple of years ago is, again, sort of challenging conventional wisdom. What are the consequences for international cooperation of SpaceX being able to provide launch? For a decade after the space shuttle got shut down, we were reliant on Russia for space launch. And even when we had tension with Russia, there was always that level of cooperation. And once we no longer rely on them, now that we can just sort of go to SpaceX and do everything, that cooperation is gone. And yeah, Russia has done some other things that have hurt our cooperation. But, even in the past, during Crimea, during Georgia, the other things that Russia has done that we didn't like, we were still launching on the Soyuz. And so I think that in that one aspect, that private development has taken away some international cooperation. In other ways, though, I think the fact that we can do things cheaper allows more countries to get involved. You have countries in Africa that are developing space organizations and signing on to Artemis, and that's because space has gotten cheaper, and that's because of the private corporations getting involved. So I do think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, and we'll see where it plays out.
Speaking of international, I'm going to jump in real quick. If you're listening over there in Australia, we like your Australian Research in Space Initiative with the acronym ARS. I know it's not real. It was a joke, but you should please make it real just so I can laugh, please. Okay. Sorry about that, Chris.
No, this is actually, it's great. He gets to say the things that I can't. So I enjoy that too.
Well, and we don't have an Australian student in our program this year, or else I totally would have pitched that to him for you.
I appreciate it. You reaching out. I've got friends in Australia because, my current work in progress, I'm writing Australian military unit. And I have to say that, normally modern publishing, they have things like sensitivity readers. You need the exact opposite, whatever you would call that, an insensitivity reader, I guess, to write Australians correctly. When he's trying to correct the speech, the dialogue, I'm like, you do realize the American censors over on Amazon will not let me say that, right? Like, I can't write that. Some of the curse words, they make you proud.
My experience with Aussies these days is pretty much limited to Bluey. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Glad you're having fun, JR. All right. So let's see. I got to give you credit, Doc. You kind of, blasted through a lot of these here. So I'm trying to have to jump around just a touch, but that's cool. So I guess this, maybe you already answered this a little bit, but what do you think is the best way to encourage military officers, especially senior officers, to read more fiction of any kind to complement stuff that's usually the service chief reading list variety and dry doctrine and things like that?
I mean, by the time they're service chiefs, I don't know that you can convince them. I think getting them when they're lieutenants and captains and majors is the best time, because they haven't had to go through the experience of higher level command, and so they're open to learning everything they can about leadership and thinking strategically, and we do it in several different ways here at ACSE. I don't want to do an ad for ACSE or our Schriever concentration, but I mentioned my elective, which is all science fiction. My boss, Dr. Andrea Harrington, does a course on space law, and they read Corey's Leviathan Wakes and talk about legal implications for some of the things that happened in that story. In our core course, we actually have them read Singer and Cole's Ghost Fleet. And so we are giving them opportunities, not the whole curriculum, 1 or 2 books in the core course, and then electives that they choose to take. We're giving them opportunities to kind of expand that horizon and see if they can draw things that are beneficial to them from science fiction. And I think that's the way you do it. You just make it clear that this isn't just, you're not taking these classes or these lessons are not just the times that you take a knee. Like, these are serious ways of studying things that can happen in the future and how to think about current events. It's, to me, reading is just, it's exercise for your brain. It doesn't matter what you do. And yeah, there's some stuff you probably shouldn't read out there, but if it helps your vocabulary, if it helps you defend your own way of thinking or challenge your way of thinking, there's still value in it. And maybe that's what some of the chiefs are missing from their list. I think their lists are great. They're right on target for the things that they want their military to be. But I think there is room for more creative thinking. Of course, that's me being the hippie civilian professor.
So to know, you and I both write reviews for Upstream Reviews, which is, its claim to fame is if they can't give it at least a 4-star, they don't review it, because life's too short for all that negativity. So maybe we'll tackle, when you retire officially, Chris, you and I will tackle the defense recommended reading list and start writing some reviews of those books. That could be an interesting project. We might hate ourselves before we're over. But so you mentioned you're not an ad for the college. Is it open to civilians as well, or is it strictly military officers for those not in the know?
It is open to civilians, but it's generally by invitation. I mean, it's not open to the general public.
Okay.
We usually have a couple of Department of the Air Force civilians in the course. In the past, we've had, Air Force security, different PME schools have different civilians. I know that like National Defense University will get State Department and Intel agency folks. So yeah, there's civilians, there's international officers. There's not just Space Force and Air Force. There's also Army, Navy, Coast Guard. So it's a good mix, like all the joint professional military education programs, but it's not open to the public.
So is there something comparable that would be open to the public that you recommend? And if you need time to think about it, I totally understand. If you want to come back to this, and we'll make a note in the show notes if you need to.
No, I mean, off the top of my head, there are programs out there that are similar in some ways. A lot of master's programs on security studies, George Washington, Georgetown. I want to say University of Denver has a program. There are some out there. They're mostly master's level, 1 or 2 year programs that focus on military history, security studies, that kind of thing. I actually did a master's at George Washington in their security policy program, so I would vouch for that. It's not exactly the same. You're not getting a class full of military officers. It's mostly civilians. You're not getting the joint warfighting and leadership stuff as much. You're getting a lot more theory. But if it's stuff that you're interested in, check it out. Any kind of security studies program in the country would be pretty good.
Okay, so we know that every sci-fi universe has its own internally consistent rules of science and technology, at least the good ones do. So what sort of tech from sci-fi should we expect from the near future? Obviously, you mentioned you're not a futurist, so this is just you as Greg Miller, the Uber fan, not Dr. Gregory Miller. This is just you, the person. What do you think?
What would I like, or what do I think is going to be realistic?
Both, now that you mentioned it.
Okay. I should learn not to ask questions. I really want to see self-driving cars because I don't want to have to deal with traffic anymore. It would be awesome to be able to just get in my car and read while on my way to work while the car's driving me. I'm hoping that's in the near future, but we'll see. I'm fascinated by the concept of quantum computing and how that might affect how we think about strategic level problems, how we plan for military operations, how we think about, codes and code breaking. I think that's sort of a fascinating field. Anything having to do with artificial intelligence, super intelligence. I enjoy reading Nick Bostrom's stuff on super intelligence, whether it comes about through physical alteration or pharmacological change. Those kinds of things are, I think, interesting and not too far on the horizon. In terms of science fiction-y stuff, space stuff, I would love to see a space elevator. I don't know that I'd have the courage to go up in it, but I just think that would be a really cool tourist attraction for wherever it would be built, somewhere on the equator, probably. Those are probably the big ones, sort of short term. Obviously, given one of my first answers to this, I would love to see a Stargate be a reality, but I don't know that that's in the works anytime soon.
I'll be honest with you. I think I'd rather do the space elevator than trust a self-driving car. That's just me, though. I'm kind of like one of those I want my hands on the wheel kind of guys.
So, what type of tech or be as granular as you want from science fiction do you think is more of a pipe dream than a reality?
I mean, probably a Stargate or a teleporter is probably a pipe dream. I'd like to think that faster than light travel of some sort is a possibility, but I'm not a physicist, so I don't know. But I'm skeptical that we'll ever get anything close to that. And that's too bad because I think that sort of limits our ability to expand very far. Those are probably the big ones that come to mind.
For me, I'm not convinced we're ever going to get the cryogenics that you see in some of the space franchises. I don't know that we're going to ever be able to perfect that level of stasis. What about you, Christopher? Since we've got you here, what do you think is a pipe dream when it comes to sci-fi tech?
Shoot. Probably the. Yeah, this is always a tough one. I don't, just based on some of the stuff we've seen, based on the Alcubierre drive and all that sort of stuff, I think there probably could be a type of FTL that we might stumble on by accident at some point, probably that more than anything else. I've still got to say, because I'm old, probably cold fusion at this point, because cold fusion is like always 10, 15 years away. And it's been 10, 15 years away my entire life. So right
Mine
now,
too.
I'm kind of on that.
Okay. All right. That's a running joke in sci-fi communities is that, whatever the FTL and cold fusion are always 15 years away. All right, Chris, the next set of questions is on you, sir.
All right. Let's see. So I think you already kind of answered this one too, because of the self-driving car, but would you abuse that tech, and how, if you had access to it?
The self-driving car, I don't know that I'd abuse. I think my stress level would drop a lot, and my road rage would die off. Assuming everybody else had self-driving cars and it wasn't just me and everyone else is driving themselves still. So I think that might be more stressful. If I had a, Stargate or a teleporter, I would abuse the hell out of that. I would go to, France for croissants in the morning and coffee and then Italy for dinner. Maybe Saturn for lunch. I don't know.
That's a good answer. So the one thing that scares me about, I'm going to save you because I see you're thinking heads going on. The one thing that scares me about the self-driving cars, PBS actually did, excuse me, an hour-long panel on it, probably about 2014, 2015, is the algorithms it uses to calculate acceptable risk. So like if it's you in the car by yourself and a bus full of nuns and little girls, crosses and it's going to be an accident, does the algorithm decide to save you or, for the greater good? It's basically the trolley problem, right?
Yeah.
And those calculations scare me that it would make those decisions. I'd almost rather trust my abilities and my reflexes to try to save myself and them than to trust the AI to say, well, you had a good run, sir, you're dead.
And that's, I mean, that's where you need the cryogenics and the ability to download your brain into a computer so you could still survive that.
They showed that on We Are Legion, the Bobaverse books, exactly how that could go wrong too. Have you read those?
No.
So he wins the lottery, this is the entry of book one. He walks across the street and gets hit by a bus. So they freeze basically his brain and it gets uploaded into satellites and then makes copies of itself and personality fragments. And it's glorious. You should check it out. I think you'll dig it.
All right.
It's kind of like Futurama on acid. And I mean, and that's saying a lot if you think about it.
Yeah, isn't Futurama already on acid?
Double acid, I guess. All right. Before we admit to anything that would get you two in trouble because your security clearances, Chris, ask the next question.
Okay, so sort of the big one is: do you believe that we'll encounter alien life at some point? And what do you think those species might look like, or might be derived from, that sort of thing?
I mean, I can't say that we wouldn't, because I mean, space is so huge. I can't imagine a scenario where we don't eventually encounter some sort of life. It may be microbes, it may be amoeba, it may be something that we don't even understand. It may not necessarily be sentient or humanoid, but I gotta believe that there's something. I think the real science fiction person in me thinks that there is something intelligent out there. I don't know that we'll encounter it in my lifetime or in the next couple of generations. But yeah, I do think there's something out there. I don't know that they're necessarily visiting us and killing our cows and making marks in cornfields. But I do think that even just the accidental chance that we happened here, there's so much out there that it seems to me it has to have happened somewhere else as well. We may never encounter each other, but yeah, I don't want to like quote the movie Contact, but if there's not somebody there, it's an awful waste of space, right?
Yes, that was what I was thinking too, but you beat me to it.
Sorry.
It's okay. That's what you're here for.
Yeah, but it's your show. I don't want to steal your thunder.
It's okay. I probably said it a billion times on the pod. They get to hear it from somebody else's voice this time, so it's a win for my audience.
There you go.
All right. So you mentioned, you expect at some point that it's possible we encounter aliens. Do you think we're going to get the forehead ridge of the Wheat Club like we got from Star Trek, or do you think it's so far unknown that we probably couldn't even imagine it?
Probably a little of both. I mean, the wonderful thing about going back and reading old science fiction, and I love, we haven't talked about this. I love reading like Foundation and Dune and 2001, some of the old stuff, or older stuff. And what I really enjoy about it is how much they get right. I mean, yes, dates are off. We're not touring Jupiter in 2001, but whether it's computers and handheld devices and smartphones and those kinds of things. I mean, science fiction writers get a lot right. And, I think there's a decent chance of that.
So this is a little off topic. So one of the things that you get in military sci-fi circles, if you talk to other authors that are in sort of the indie scene where I frequent, is that if you really want to get a diehard audience, write about coasties, because they're the branch that everyone forgets exists. Even the Space Force, as new as it is, gets more play than the Coast Guard generally get in science fiction. I have written with Chris's wife, in full disclosure, a Space Coastie story for an anthology. But as we think realistically, do you think there's room for a Coast Guard in a space setting other than just, terra firma?
Yeah, actually, I mean, this is a conversation we have in our classes is does Space Force need to be thinking about itself not only as, a blue water type of Navy going out into space, but a Coast Guard, Space Guard type of force to do things like rescues in space, or near, cislunar types of operations. Whether that's part of Space Force or Coast Guard in space, I think that's definitely in the cards for the future. I just don't know what form it would take. But if you think of the location, between the Earth and the Moon, cislunar space, who's in charge of that? It seems a lot like what the Coast Guard does for our coastal defense and search and rescue type of operations.
So in the story Jamie and I wrote, we had them essentially, taking the buoy tenders to, satellite tending in space, was sort of our take on it. And then shenanigans happened. Do you think we will see it as a Space Guard or a Coast Guard in space? Like as Space Guard meaning maybe a new branch of service? Or would they just transfer their mission? Or could it go either way?
Yeah, I mean, I could see it going either way. It depends on which members of Congress are most influential at the time that the decisions get made, I guess.
Fair. So
go ahead. Sorry.
I was just saying, this is a sort of a pivot on that same question, but more near and dear to your Air Force heart. Do you see, now that the Space Force has been stood up, the Air Force having a role in space as a legitimate branch of service beyond Earth?
Probably less so now that there's a Space Force. I mean, there are still people in Air Force that do space, so I don't think that's going away. Just like there's, Army FA-40s who do space. There's naval space operators. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. But my hunch is most of the new missions are probably going to go to Space Force. Otherwise, why have it?
So
Right.
I know.
I was going to
Go ahead,
say,
Chris.
no, actually, as now that we're AF Space here at First Air Force as well, we're actually the air component to U.S. Spacecom, and really our bailiwick is to do Air Force air component things for space. So if you want to think of it this way, we're like the only purely terrestrial component that Spacecom has. Surface up to the 100-kilometer mark, which is where Space Force and CIFSIC, I'm sorry, and the Space Force service component for Spacecom sort of takes over at that point. And then when stuff comes back down again, like capsules from the ISS, and we posture personnel recovery assets, just in case again something goes wrong, or to just help with the recovery. Then that's sort of like how the Air Force is playing into how Spacecom at least is operating, and that's just one of the missions. But that's the one that's most developed right now, and future missions are sort of there's a timeline for those. Just like Spacecom itself is still pretty new.
So there is speculation that you'll always have the Army, Navy, Air Force, et cetera, on all the planet side stuff because somebody's still got to do it. I mean, assuming we go to planets with atmospheres, et cetera, on other in other galaxies, but that when it comes to the actual space component, you'll have essentially like a Navy Marine Corps duo of Space Fleet and something else for the space component. But having
Space
seen
Marines,
how
yeah.
Yeah, Space Marines. Having seen how the branches fought over access to the slice of the pie that was the Iraq War to justify budgets, I don't know that I buy that every branch won't have something out there. I mean, I remember them trying to send fleet ship driving officers to manage convoys just so they could say they had people in Iraq to justify more money. So I don't see that changing. You know what I mean? Like, but I know, some people that think more highbrow have other opinions on how that might play out, a more idealized version, maybe.
No, I mean,
So-
and you go back to the past. I mean, every service wanted a piece of the nuclear triad. Every service wanted to keep their air component when the Air Force was first created. I mean, that's pretty standard, bureaucracy 101.
Yeah, I actually knew somebody that was in the Army when the Air Force was stood up, and he ended up in the Air Force when they went, you Army, you Air Force, and they just took all their uniforms, dumped them in a thing of boiling water, and made them blue. So, like, it's not that long ago that the Army Air Corps wasn't, what is the Air Force now. So, things can happen quickly once they start moving, I suspect.
True, and to the Space Force's credit, they had that model to look at and go, okay, so what did they get right? What did they get wrong? So I actually think the Space Force's approach to standing up as a separate branch is worth looking at because I think they've done a lot of the right things overall in trying to separate themselves. I mean, I'll keep comments on the service dress uniform prototype to myself.
That's okay. We set them on our episode where we talked about the Space Force. I'll link that in the show notes. Chris doesn't have to give an official opinion. I gave mine.
But
Although,
you also brought up a good point too, though. To the Navy's credit, though, JR, during the war, they even set up a whole Naval Expeditionary Command. They had something like 40,000 sailors that were augmenting the Army. I worked with a couple of those guys when I was in Iraq. A lot of intel people, EOD. So, and the CRAM bubbas, because when they started taking those little R2D2 guns off of boats and putting them onto ground installations, they had that something to train the air defense people how to do it. So it's interesting. Jointness, I don't think is going away. Is I guess a good way to think about it.
Technology has made that even more so. I have seen as I was getting out of the Army and I was medically retired in 2007, they were taking the Sea-Wiz, which were anti-missile defense for ships, and mounting them on trucks and using them for ground-based stuff. So I think a lot of that is gonna be some overlaps, I suspect, going forward. It was just an interesting time, and I think it forced us to get creative. So hopefully that continues that inter-service cooperation.
I mean, historically, the services are much more cooperative when they're in war than when they're in garrison, right? At times like this, we're fighting over budgets and recruiting numbers and things like that. When you're actually in war, it seems that cooperation is much more likely.
Do you see the push for colonization being able to galvanize people like the westward expansion did, and without having to have some sort of intergalactic war to get that cooperation?
I think it comes down to whether there's actually any profit in it. I think if one of the big sources of tension between countries is resource scarcity. And if we can show that there's, rare earth minerals or valuable minerals of some sort, if there's even just space for living, that alleviates a lot of the conflict on the earth. And so I think that could be a source of releasing tension in some ways. Then again, if we find really valuable resources that are incredibly scarce, then I think that's just going to make conflict even more likely to be the first to get there and hold on to it. So I think it could go either way.
Well, the good news is, as we wrap this up, when in space, nobody can hear the Marines eat their crowns. So I think that's how the quote goes, right, Chris?
Oh, dude, I'm stealing that. That's a good one. I'm keeping that one. Thank you.
Outstanding. All right, so clearly this interview is winding down. We could keep you here forever with these hypothetical fun questions, and we're definitely going to have you back. This was a lot of fun. But was there anything we didn't ask you about Sun Tzu in space before we let you go? I know it's out in ebook and hardcover, or at least it will be when this episode airs. Any plans to do your own audiobook of it?
No, but I don't know that anyone wants to hear me. I'm holding out for Matthew McConaughey maybe to do the audio. I haven't seen him in anything recently, so I don't know if he's busy. I don't know. I haven't Naval Institute Press hasn't talked to me about any kind of audiobook plan. I don't know if it depends on how well it sells. I'd love to see that. Because I think that might be the only way some of my students ever read my book is if there's an audiobook, but I don't know. We'll see.
Okay. So, Chris, did you want to give us any final thoughts before I wrap this up? I know you came on here as my special subject matter expert guy.
No, I appreciate the chance to do this. This was really fun and insightful. And like I said, Dr. Miller, I'd like to follow up with you, when you got some time about day job type stuff.
Absolutely. And one last thing I'll mention, if I could. So we're in Maxwell Air Force Base right now in Montgomery, Alabama, but starting in the fall, we're standing up a Space Force professional military education program. Some people may have seen news clips about it. We're going to be partnering with Johns Hopkins University. So we're kind of breaking the PME model. All of our students are getting a master's from Johns Hopkins. And we'll be basically teaching the same thing that we have been here. It's just much more, big thinking and philosophy and strategy that'll be going on for the Space Force and the sister service students that attend the school. So I'll be part of that program. I'm looking forward to it. Being in DC and teaching as part of that program. So I don't know if any of your audience is interested in that, but that's something on the horizon.
Okay. That is good to know. Change is always good, although sometimes hard. But we're going to end the show, dear listener, dear viewers, like we always do. We're going to remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right books, and that also applies to the academic highbrow stuff. It's still on Amazon where you can leave reviews. I found it on the Air Force War College's official website. Can you review over there at all? I haven't played with the website since I found it on Amazon.
On Naval Institute Press, I think you can. I have to go back and check.
Okay, so wherever you buy it, leave a review.
Sure.
If not, go to Goodreads. But your reviews matter. Tell a friend, tell a dozen friends, buy a dozen copies for your friends. But do your part, people. It really helps. And with that said, Dr. Gregory Miller, how can listeners and viewers find you if they wanted to reach out and inquire more?
I am on, well, you found me over email, but you said it was a little bit tough. We don't make it easy to find our faculty. I am on the Twitter. I'm at the strategy prof on Twitter. I don't post a lot, but what I do is incredibly insightful and intelligent. And at least that's what my wife says.
Naturally.
That's really the only social media that I'm on. Otherwise I'm Googleable. I have a .mil for those who are in the military and want to find me on the global. And I'll be at Johns Hopkins starting next year if you want to find me there.
Okay, that is fair. That is fair. You can find us, dear listener, on Twitter at twitter.com/SF_fantasy_show, Sierra Foxtrot _fantasy_show. You can email us at blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. Again, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. We have a Facebook group where all the shenanigans happen at facebook.com/groups/Blasters and Blades podcast. Again, /groups/Blasters and Blades podcast. As usual, we do have a Facebook page as well. We need a few more likes and follows to get the algorithm to let us have a dedicated URL. So make that happen for us, people. You can search that in the little Facebook search bar and it'll pop right up. We have a website at anchor.fm/blasters and blades. Again, anchor.fm/blasters-and-blades, where you can support the show for as little as 99 cents a month. Or you can support the show more directly over at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that it is for the podcast, and I will promise I will keep my co-hosts, Doc Cisca and Nick Garber, duly caffeinated. They will drink until their liver explodes. And if they were here, they would tell you their mama didn't raise no quitters. But before I bring us completely home, I realized I was very rude. And Chris, how can listeners and viewers find you?
Okay, so I got an Amazon author page. I'm Chris Denote there. My wife Jamie is on there as herself, but also as her pen name, Liska McCabe. We've got a couple of works out there. We have a combined authors page on Facebook as well, Chris and Jamie Denote Authors with a question mark, because we're still kind of working on that. As well as I do have a Twitter account as well. That's just under my natural name. For anybody who wants to try to find me there, I try to keep it to mostly writing stuff. Speaking of which, I need to get back to it a bit. So, but thanks for the opportunity, JR.
Absolutely. And we appreciate you guys sticking with us. So thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For the absentee Nick Garber and Doc Cisca, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom.